You can't overstate how important the exile in Babylon, even though it was just compared to the world population today, a few thousand people in this little minority religious group of people called the Jews. At least that's what they were called when they came back from Babylon. But because of the fact that this culture was what gave us this, is this minority culture that was always dominated by the empires that were around them, were some of the most prolific and prophetic people that have ever walked the face of the planet. They gave us the Hebrew Bible, and then from that, the New Testament. And everything that Jesus did, he said, I didn't come to abolish the Hebrew Bible. He calls it the law and the prophets. That was just another way of talking about the Bible. He said, I didn't come to abolish it, but to fulfill it. And so Jesus is even saying, every prophetic part that was in the Hebrew Bible, I am embodying that mission and what it means to be saved. And then Jesus, as you know, was crucified on the cross and then went to go be with his Father in heaven. And some 40 years later, the city of Jerusalem was destroyed. And it ended that identity of having come back and now surviving. And so, but still stuck in the psyche of the Jewish people was this idea, fleeing Babylon. Only now it was different. Babylon was no longer the world power. Babylon proper, the city, which is in Iraq. Babylon proper, the ancient city, was no longer the predominant city. What was? For those early Christians, their Babylon was Jerusalem. Because now Jerusalem is destroyed, and now they were living in different parts of the world in the Christian diaspora. The audience of the book of Revelation were living up in Asia Minor. And so one of the hardest things to get out, I talked about the harlot last week, the great harlot. Tonight I want to talk about Babylon the Great, who's fallen. And to wrap your brain around this is that those two metaphors are the exact same thing. Babylon the Great is the great harlot, and the great harlot is Babylon the Great, and both of them are Jerusalem. So I told you last week, I know that this is a minority. I don't know. I haven't done a survey. Maybe 5%, maybe 10% of the theologians in the world identify it as Jerusalem, but that's not because it's wrong. There's a reason for that. One is that the majority historically of end times preachers have been futurists. So that's a broad category for anybody that believes the book of Revelation is primarily predicting the future. Well, for the future of the early church, who else could it be, that dominant city that's going to fall? It has to be Rome. The only problem with that is that Rome never fell. Well, it did around 400 AD when the Goths came and sacked it. But by then, it had become Christian. So it doesn't make sense for Christian Rome to fall and to flee out of Christian Rome. And so the whole thing just doesn't make sense. The other reason for it is that those of us that are Protestant, unless you're Catholic, you're Protestant, or you could be Orthodox. One of the theories after the Reformation was reviving that futurist idea of the book of Revelation. And then the great harlot and Babylon became Rome because that's where the center of the Catholic Church was. And so out of Catholicism and out of that Protestant Reformation, everybody was convinced, oh, this is Rome. And there's some other reasons. There's a couple of little tie-ins, and I'll be honest about it because I get why you could look at it as Rome. But I'm just telling you, I'll explain my long math. Did I convince anybody last week talking about the great harlot? You know, why would Rome be the harlot? Rome was the beast. You know, Rome is the one that's coming and attacking, and Jerusalem is the harlot because the harlot is that unfaithful wife that goes and has relations with Rome. And that was Jerusalem. And does that make sense? That's why Jerusalem is a prostitute, which follows all of the Old Testament prophets. So tonight I want to talk about who Babylon the Great is. And it's going to quote a lot from this section, but actually major parts of Isaiah and Jeremiah though the core of them were written back in those days, there were later sections of it that were written in this period right here, the purple period, the Persian period. After Cyrus the Great came and conquered the Babylonians, which is in the Old Testament, the fall of Babylon, and then the subsequent coming back out, fleeing out of Babylon. Tonight's message, the big title is Fleeing Babylon. I had a lot of different ones, but that's it. And what's great is so many of these word pictures, when you get over the need to try to predict the future with the Bible, you begin to listen to the message of it, and there really is a message for us. What's Babylon for us? What's the foreign power that's, and not just foreign like a different country, but the foreign to the ways of God? Are we living in Babylon right now? Oh, yeah. You begin to look at it that way. And what does it mean to flee Babylon? Does that mean we're supposed to leave? Well, no, because whatever country you move to, that becomes your new Babylon, right? So we're living as strangers in this world. And so what does it mean to come out from the world? Does that mean we stop associating with people from the world? Or does it mean that we stop living like the people of the world? Are you with me? And so coming out of fleeing Babylon is really a really big picture, spiritual prophecy for the early church, that it too needed to finally leave Babylon and begin to be the church that it was called to be. All right, let's just read what it says here tonight. It starts at this, and after these things, so that's a phrase that starts a new vision. He says, I saw another angel coming down out of the sky. This is how you know you're reading apocalyptic literature. There are some times that the revelation is coming from a voice from the throne, which would be God saying it, and oftentimes it's an angel. So in most apocalyptic literature that you read, that's it. In the Hebrew Bible and outside of the Hebrew Bible, first step is you get a visit from an angel, and an angel tells you something. So everything that follows that, in fact, almost everything in chapter 18 of the book of Revelation is an oracle spoken by an angel. So it's almost like poetry. Specifically, it's a lamentation. We have a book in the Bible called the Lamentations, which, by the way, was written, it's a big long poem written in response to the destruction of Jerusalem the first time. It's 5 chapters long, and each verse begins with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet until you get to chapter 3, and then it does that 5 different times. And it's an absolutely amazing work of prophecy and poetry, one of the greatest. And it's very sad, and it's a lamentation. And so the chapter 18 of the book of Revelation is, it takes up a lamentation, which is like a mourning song. It's kind of a mix, because there's some parts of it that are kind of, it's mourning the death of Babylon, but it's also kind of celebrating it. It's explaining it, and it's written in response to it. And so he says, and this angel had great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. There's a line like that, a luminous angel comes in Daniel chapter 10. So he borrows a lot from the Old Testament prophets. Specifically tonight, he's going to borrow a lot of language and motifs and word pictures from Isaiah and Jeremiah. Specifically, 2nd Isaiah and 2nd Jeremiah, which are the sections that were written after the exile. And so it says, and he cried with a mighty voice, saying, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a habitation of demons, a prison of every unclean spirit, and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. And so, all right, most people will say, and I read it, all of my favorite commentaries still, they have that in their brain, that this is Rome. I don't believe it is, but I wouldn't die at the stake for it. But it makes more sense for Babylon the Great to be Jerusalem, because that is the place that the early Christians fled from. You with me? So if the audience is sitting in Jerusalem, then it's someplace else. But if Babylon the Great is the place that we fled from for our lives, then that was Jerusalem. And Jerusalem got destroyed. And so this phrase is from a place, and by the way, notice, especially in this place, in apocalypses, time doesn't really matter. You can go back in time, you can go in front of time, you can go back in time and then preach about something as if it hasn't happened yet, even though it already has. I call that post-diction as opposed to prediction. But it goes back in time, it does this. And all of a sudden, right here, in the midst of these visions, which are kind of far and above over the earth, he talks about the fall of Babylon as if it's something that's already happened. Well, the fall of Babylon happened in 539 BC, but the fall of this Babylon, if this is a future prediction, we say, my commentary said, well, prophets sometimes talked about things that had already happened, things that were going to happen as if they've already happened. I don't think so. I think in this case, we're in 95 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed in 70. He's talking in past tense verbs because it's already happened. Yeah? This is in the aorist tense, fallen. It's not an adjective, it's a verb. It should say has fallen, Babylon the Great, because it's a verb and it's aorist, which means it's already happened. It happened in a point in time. And the whole point about her being uninhabited, so I have to say this before I go on. I have a retraction, you know, like when newspapers make a misstatement and they make a retraction. And I want you to know this. This is how I am. If you were to come, if I do this series 5 years from now, there's probably some of my theories this time that I will have corrected because I keep learning. And one of the misstatements that I made last week or the week before, I can't remember, maybe both, was that Babylon was in ruins at the time of the writing of the book of Revelation. And it wasn't. So I get that from the Old Testament writers because they talk about the fall of Babylon as if it's, you know, it was just completely deserted after that. Megiddo was completely abandoned. So he uses Har Megiddo or Mount Megiddo, where we get Armageddon. He uses that as a metaphor for Jerusalem. But I did more reading, and actually Babylon in 539 BC, it was conquered by the Persians, and it ceased to be the center of the world. Up until that time, until about 300 BC, it was probably the largest city in the world and a major capital of Mesopotamia who ruled the world. And so its power came to an end, but I found out later on they kept rebuilding it and using it. So it never became completely a ruins. But why it's still prophetic is that the fall of Babylon precipitated their returning back to the Holy Land. Kirk told me a couple weeks ago, it was like taking a drink out of a fire hydrant. So if I start going, any questions so far? Comments about what I just said? Yeah? Okay. And here's where he's drawing from. This is kind of going back to that song, American Pie, how he draws from lyrics from old 50 songs. And if you haven't seen that one, by the way, and don't know what I'm talking about, was it the third week? One of the weeks I played the song American Pie and explained what all of the metaphors were and the word pictures and what it had to do with the death of the 50s and the birth of the 60s and everything that was going on geopolitically, and all the metaphors kind of mix in like this. And I said, if you can understand what American Pie is singing about, you can understand the book of Revelation. Because that's how it's communicating, in word pictures. And it's going to tie in geopolitical with all sorts of things and mix the metaphors together to make this kaleidoscope. And so where he borrows from is a lot of words and word pictures from Isaiah. So this is Isaiah about the fall of Babylon, the actual Babylon, right? And he answered, fallen is Babylon. It's an exact quote, although this is in Hebrew. And when John says it, it's in Greek. He says, and the engraved images of her God are broken to the ground. Jeremiah says, Babylon shall become heaps, a dwelling place of her jackals, an astonishment and a hissing without inhabitant. And so it's verses like this that I think I've thought this for a lot of years, that got it in my head that after Babylon was destroyed by the Persians, that it was just in ruins and heaps. This is prophetic language, and so that's not actually the case. But so here's Babylon. It's up in Mesopotamia. It was the oldest excavations are somewhere in the third millennium BC. So way back in way back. It's one of the oldest cities in the world. In 1792, Hammurabi established it as his capital. In the library of my college, they had a copy of the big obelisk of the Code of Hammurabi, which is one of the oldest law codes. It's about this tall. It's made out of obsidian. It's just a copy of it. But anyway, he was important in establishing it. The Kassites from Hatti, the Hittites, came down and conquered it in 1595. And then for most of the Assyrian Empire, which is the first stage of the Bible, is under the Assyrians, it was always under Assyrian control. Even though it wasn't the capital of Assyria, Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, where Jonah was sent to prophesy. But they gave Sennacherib such a hard time in 689, he came and razed it to the ground, which is what you had to do with a rebellious city. Several years later, the Chaldeans take over. The Chaldeans were a people group, and then for several generations, they were the ruling clan. And so the first of them was Nabopolassar, and in about 626, he established the dynasty and made Babylon the capital. So now, and the surrounding empire was called the Babylonian or the Neo-Babylonian Empire, named after the capital city. And so, yes, they're all BC dates. That's why they go in reverse order. Sorry. Yeah, all of this is BC. And so the Chaldean dynasty begins, and then Nebuchadnezzar II, who's the famous one from the Bible, after the kingdom of Judah stops paying the tribute, they come down and destroy Jerusalem and the first temple and carry the people away into exile. And so Babylon, oh man, there's this great psalm, there by the rivers, there in Babylon we hung our harps, and they begged us to sing a song, but how can we sing a song how can we sing the songs of Zion when we're so far away from our homeland? I just butchered it. But it's a great lament about being in Babylon and wanting to go home. And so Nebuchadnezzar was also a part of the Chaldean dynasty. And then lastly, 539 BC, Cyrus, the Persian, conquered it and returned the exiles. So I didn't bring a copy of in the Museum of London, which I was right next to and couldn't go to because of the timing of it. But there is a cylinder, a clay cylinder like this, written in cuneiform, and on it there's a proclamation by Cyrus the Great to return all the exiles to their homeland. Not because he was a nice guy, even though from the Jewish perspective it was a miracle for them to get to be returned. But he was under the opinion that part of the reason that the Chaldeans failed was because they dishonored the local gods of the kingdoms they conquered. And so it was actually kind of theologically selfish of him. He thought, one of the ways that we're going to establish our empire is we're going to let all of those local kingdoms have their own gods. And so he sent some of the exiles back and gave them permission to rebuild the temple. And so that was a huge part of it. Then in about 331, Alexander the Great came through and took the city once again. And that's where Alexander died in 323 BC. And after that, it continued to be inhabited, but never again, after it was conquered, was it the center of the world. It was never again the primary city. On down through it's just Saddam Hussein tried to rebuild it to some extent. It's just a ruins now, but it was never again the great center of the world that oppressed everybody. And so, in Revelation 18 says, "For all the nations have drunk the wine of the wrath of her adultery," which is the exact same language it used about the great harlot last week. Do you remember that? And so the great harlot is Babylon. They're the same thing. They're both metaphors for Jerusalem. And to drink the wrath of her adultery, some translations say sexual immorality. This is not talking about actual adultery. This is talking about the idolatry of the city of Jerusalem, which should have been the center and was the center of the worship of Yahweh. And they let in pagan idols and they let in all this pagan worship and they sold themselves out. So Jerusalem's idolatry it's not talking about a person. It's talking about idolatry and selling out to the Roman culture and to the emperor cult and to the worship of idols. It says, and the kings of the land committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the land grew rich from the abundance of her luxuries. Notice once again what a difference it is when you translate the word eretz as land instead of earth. So most modern English translations say earth because they're moving from the assumption that this is a prediction of the future. And so when you say land, you can realize, oh, this is talking about what happened back in that day. And I heard another voice come from heaven saying, so there's a second oracle. That was the end of the first oracle. Now here's a second oracle. It doesn't say who it's from, but we just assume it's another angel. But I heard another voice saying, come out of her, my people, that you have no participation in her sins, and that you don't receive of her plagues, for her sins have reached the sky, and God has remembered her iniquities. Come out of them, my people. Who are my people in the book of Revelation? What's that? It's the Christians. It's the church, right? This prophecy was written to the early church, to encourage the early church. It says it in first to the 7 churches in Asia Minor. That's who the audience. Come out of them. They're living up in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. So who are they? We know this is the church. Where did the church come out of? It came out of Jerusalem. And so it doesn't make sense for, say, come out from her and talking about Rome. So in Isaiah 48:20, this is now flashing back to the actual fleeing of Babylon. These prophecies are about 539 during the Persian period. Several of the prophets are saying phrases like this. So this is for us. Leave Babylon. Flee from the Babylonians. Announce this with shouts of joy and proclaim it. Zechariah says, come, flee out of the land of the north, says Yahweh. For I have spread you abroad to the 4 winds of the sky, says Yahweh. Come, Zion, escape, you who dwell in daughter Babylon. Right. So these are the prophets. This isn't a metaphor. He's actually telling these people, because think about it, they'd been now 2 generations, since 586 to 539. They'd been now 2 generations, which, by the way, approximately 40 years is why we have these motifs of the wilderness wanderings for 40 years, and why Jesus fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. That's all recalling the time in the exile. So he's saying, flee, get out of... And these are prophets telling people actually get out of actual Babylon, with me, because they didn't want to leave. The Hanging Gardens were there, one of the wonders of the ancient world. They had culture. It was the largest city in the world. So picture the art. Imagine the food. Imagine the food truck scene they had in Babylon back in the day. They probably had the best music, the best entertainment, the best sports. It was pretty comfy in Babylon, only that wasn't their home. And so the prophets had to tell them, get out of Babylon. I know you're comfy there, but that's not where you belong. That is not your home. You hear that? Is there a Christian message in there somewhere? I think there is. What's your Babylon? What's your part of the world that's just so comfy you can't leave it? You know, it's hard. We live in the world long enough. I don't know about you, but I'm a creature of comfort. You know, my main chair is called a lazy boy for a reason. It's not called the risky boy. It's called a lazy boy. It leans back. I just, get my favorite beverage and watch a game. It's easy to get comfy, isn't it? And so leave Babylon is just one of these great, it's going to always preach. Leaving Babylon means never forget that this world is not our home, that we have an eternal home in heaven. We have a place that's even better than this. Yeah? All right. But these guys are talking about actual Babylon. Depart, get out from there. Touch no unclean thing. Oh, listen to that. Come out from it and be pure, you who carry the articles of the Lord's house. Come out of it. So I ask this question again. How do we come out of the world? The Bible says we can be in the world, but not of it. It said that Jesus said, I didn't ask you to take them out of the world, but they're not of the world, even as I'm not of the world. And so I don't think, if we cut off all the people that aren't Christians, how are we ever going to be witnesses, right? So I'm actually always challenged with trying to get out of my church bubble and build relationships. It's why I loved coaching my kids, because I got to meet their parents and doing stuff where we get to be around other people, yeah? And so coming out of Babylon and being pure doesn't mean we cut off relationships, but it is talking about our lifestyle. You know, we can be different. Anyway, anybody have a thought on that? What's Babylon look like to you? I'm doing my best, Judy. Try and make it. All right. Yes, Mike. Yeah, wait for the microphone.
I think it's the challenge of every age of believer is to be in the world, but not of the world.
Yeah.
And for all of us, that's different.
Yep.
And to not get into the mindset.
Yes.
And the priorities.
Yeah.
And we have to constantly watch it.
Yep.
You know, I watched the State of the Union last night. It would be easy to get into that.
Yeah.
Politics, which is not, I mean, we vote and we get involved, but you can get too far.
Yeah.
And I did at one point, and my wife hit me.
Yeah.
You know, but, you know, we're not of this world.
Yeah.
And we need to be reminded of that all the time.
Yeah, that's right. We're not of this world. And I'm not, by the way, I never want to be a political church. I have no problem with people being political. I would hate to go to a church where the guy was of the opposite party of me and was always preaching his side. I would hate that. And I know in Columbia County, we're a bit mixed. So I just respect everybody. But I have my own opinions. But, you know, it's hard. There are some people, Mike, as you mentioned, that being a Christian and being a Democrat are the exact same thing. Or being a Christian and being a Republican are the exact same thing. And they can't get it out of their mind that those are different things, that my politics can be here. And I know stuff crosses over sometimes, but I don't want my religion to be about the things of the world. I want it to be just between me and Jesus, and it does not mean it's wrong to be political or to take a side or to vote for your team. But Charles.
Something that I read.
Wait for the microphone if you could, please. Just for my buddy Kenny who's watching, wait for the microphone, then they can hear you online. Yes, sir.
You were talking about getting out,
Yeah.
associating and spreading, you know.
Yeah.
And something I read the other day, and I read it to her. It said, you know, if you smile to somebody, it's not going to change their lives. Mm-hmm. But if you smile at somebody, you can change their life for a day.
Yeah.
So it's about just reaching out and touching somebody.
Making a difference, shining the light bright.
There.
Yeah, I love it. I noticed a little Easter egg. Yeah, go ahead, brother. And I'll show you my Easter egg right here. That's right. Sorry.
No, I just heard an interview with the host of Survivor
Yeah.
today, and you know he's been with that show for 25 years, and he said the only way to win this game is to lie, cheat, and steal.
Yeah.
And he said, and that's a metaphor for your life. You know, you need to do that if you want to succeed, and that's exactly what we need to come out of.
Wow. Yeah, that's something. Yeah. How do you do that? You know, being a business person and being an honest one. You know, you don't have to do it the way the world does it. We don't fight with the weapons of the world. I love it. Sister Judy, tell me the folks that used to own CB Glass. Remember? The sister comes here, and her husband passed away many years back. Put a lot of the windows and the mirrors in here in the church. They own CB Glass. That's okay if you don't remember. But her husband, what? That's all right. He was the sweetest guy. He owned a family business in here, and never once did I have a contract with him. He'd come and he'd tell me, this is how much it's going to cost. And I said, do we need a contract? He goes, nope. because my entire career I've never had a contract. If he told you that that was the price, that was the price. And if it cost him more or things went over again, that was the price. You didn't need a handshake, you didn't need a contract. Let me just tell you, of all the thousands and thousands of dollars we spent in this building, most contractors were not like that. Their word didn't mean anything. And I said that at his funeral when he passed away. I said, man, what an amazing testimony, isn't it? You don't have to do things like the world does. There's a little Easter egg there. This is from those who carry the articles of the Lord's house. So that's when they were returning. One of the articles in the Lord's house was the 7-branched menorah. This thing right here that was the lampstand. So when he says that if you violate your testimony in the first couple of chapters, he said, I'll come and remove your lamp, or the lampstand, or the Lord walks amongst the lampstand. There was a lampstand in the Holy of Holies. This is on the Arch of Titus, which is in Rome. So Titus was the general that mopped up the last stage of the campaign. His father Vespasian was emperor by then. When he returned to Rome, they had a huge parade. And they paraded some of the victims through the streets, and Domitian, who was his little brother, rode a white horse behind him, and they paraded the articles that they took out of the temple. So this is a huge deal. The destruction of Jerusalem was really for Vespasian. It was the establishment of his dynasty, the Flavian dynasty, which was his son, which was Vespasian and Titus and Domitian on. So the destruction of Judea and the temple in Jerusalem was a huge deal. It was the most significant event in human history at the time. And so it's surprising to me how many Christians don't even know about it. But I think you can't understand the book of Revelation without knowing some of the history. So anyway, other than that, you're just spent guessing it. What in the world is Babylon the Great? I remember reading this because somebody told me to read my Bible when I was in junior high. I had no idea what this was about. Now I do. Anyway, it says, return to her just as she returned, and repay her double as she did, and according to her works. In the cup which she mixed, mix her double. And so there's this idea in Old Testament prophecy that part of the vindication of God's people in the end is not only that they're going to be set free, but also the kingdom that oppressed them and that killed them off is going to get its comeuppance. Yeah? So that's the idea of this in general. This is talking about, once again, it's assigning blame to some extent, depending on how you feel about that. Did everybody in Jerusalem deserve to be put to the sword because of what some of the priests did and whatever? But part of the messages of the book of Revelation is that the launch of the early church, its vindication was the fact that Jerusalem got destroyed, because it was originally the persecutor of the church. In Jeremiah 51:6, he says, flee out of the midst of Babylon and save every man his life. Don't be cut off in her iniquity, for it is the time of Yahweh's vengeance, and he will render to her recompense. Or what did I say? Comeuppance. Same exact thing. He's going to pay it to her. And so notice, by the way, this is clear back in Jeremiah 500 years, 600 years before the book of Revelation, and it's also talking about Babylon as her. So there's some of this language that, the writer of the book of Revelation, he knew these books like the back of his hand. He was very, very well schooled in the Old Testament. It says, however much she glorified herself and grew wanton, so much give her the torment and mourning. For she says in her heart, I sit a queen, and I am no widow, and I will in no way see mourning, which is almost a direct quote from Isaiah chapter 47. Here's his version. Now therefore hear this, you who are given to pleasures, who sit securely, who say in your heart, I am, and there is no one beside me. I shall not sit as a widow, neither shall I know the loss of children. But in two things shall come to you in a moment, in one day, the loss of children and widowhood. So this is the original prophecy about the fall of Babylon. And now John of the Revelation is is recalling all of that motif and applying it to the fall of Jerusalem. In verse 8, he says, therefore in one day, that's the one day he steals from it, the plagues will come, death, mourning, and famine, and she will be utterly burned with fire, for the Lord God who has judged her is strong. And once again, last week we had, remember towards the end of the prophecies about the great harlot, it says, and then the beast and the kings of the land turned on her and burnt her utterly with fire. And it makes perfect sense for me if that's about Jerusalem. It doesn't make sense for me if it's about something else or about Rome. So, and it also uses it once again now Babylon, and she'll be utterly burned with fire. So I've showed a couple of other clips from this YouTube kind of recreation. I'm kind of a history nerd, so I could watch tons of these videos about about the different historic battles in World War II and World War I and Vietnam and all that stuff. So I'll just show you, it's only take about 3 minutes, but I'll show you how the end of the destruction of Jerusalem happened. So we already had, first of all, John and Simon, John of Gishgalah and Simon, I forget where he's from, but the two rebel leaders in the city of Jerusalem that I think roughly are what he's talking about of the two witnesses, but it's kind of a stretch, but there's no other two main characters that were there. And so already now the Romans, after a 3-month siege, have broken through. You remember last week or the week before, they broke into the temple and burnt the temple to the ground. Josephus says it was an accident. I don't believe him. He said that Titus, remember, Josephus got adopted by Vespasian, and Titus went home to Rome and changed his name to Flavius Josephus. So he's not unbiased. He usually tries to give Titus the benefit of the doubt. And he says when they broke through, Titus said, no, don't destroy the temple. But some guys got crazy and threw a torch in there. Up to you whether you believe them or not. But the point is, it got burnt to the ground, and they didn't stop there. So I ended with that part. I'll just show you the last part of the mopping up operations.
Though the Temple Mount had fallen, Jewish resistance in the rest of Jerusalem had not. Simon's militia and those who had escaped the smoldering ruins of the temple regrouped atop the entrenched positions in the upper city and Herod's palace. From here, they faced off against the legions across the Tirapane Valley. A parley was held atop a bridge linking the two sides. The Jewish commanders, Simon and John, attempted to bargain for their free passage out of Jerusalem. Titus, however, was emboldened by his recent victory and demanded no less than an unconditional surrender. When talks broke down, the legions were unleashed on the lower city in a demonstration of force. For 2 days, they hacked their way through tight alleys and rooftops, cutting down rebels and non-combatants alike. Fires were also set to clear out any survivors from the lower districts. The flames did tremendous damage to life and property. They also engulfed vast quantities of dead bodies in various stages of decay, filling the air with a horrid stench. All that remained now was the last stronghold of Herod's palace. Defenders attempted to offer resistance from atop the walls, but were easily swept aside by mass fire of Roman projectiles. Sections of the western wall began to crumble. Legionaries punched their way through the breaches against a defensive force that was quickly disintegrating. It seems that the reality of a final defeat swept in with the Roman troops and captured the battlements more quickly than any sword could. The high towers of the Hippicus, the Phasael, and the Miriam were all abandoned as survivors either gave in to the inevitable or went to ground. The Jewish leaders, along with groups of dedicated fighters, ran in all directions, desperately seeking to find a way through the Roman lines. Many were caught by Roman street patrols, while others resorted to crawling through sewers or even attempted to tunnel their way out of the city. In the end, both Simon and John were captured alive. They, along with 700 other young men, would be sent to Rome to be put on full display for the eventual triumph of Titus. All remaining males of the age of 17 and above were shackled and sentenced to death, either in the mines of Egypt or in the gladiatorial arenas around the empire. The women and children were taken to the slave markets. All told, we have no accurate figures for how many lives were extinguished or enslaved as a result of the sacking of Jerusalem. Josephus would have us believe that over 1.1 million were killed, while Tacitus offers a more plausible 600,000. These numbers both seem wildly inflated, but may be an indication of the carnage that took place when Titus resolved on destroying a highly populated city filled with refugees and pilgrims. We have only to look at the modern sieges like Stalingrad to imagine the horrors which befell the numerous non-combatants trapped within the walls. Back in Rome, Emperor Vespasian was busy preparing the stage for the honorable return of his son. The victory at Jerusalem warranted a triumph and would be used as a centerpiece for the legitimization of the Flavian dynasty. When the time came, Titus would parade down the streets of Rome atop a chariot at the head of a procession glorifying the conquests in the east. Soldiers and captives marched down the streets in full regalia alongside floats depicting dramatic scenes from the campaign. Vast amounts of treasure were also on display, including the great 7-branch menorah. The Siege of Jerusalem stands out as one of the most brutal examples of classical-era total war since the fall of Carthage 200 years earlier.
That's it. Any questions about that battle? Any thoughts? Pretty gruesome. They don't know. The reason Josephus says 1.1 million, which I agree is probably an exaggeration. In the ancient histories, they often exaggerated. It's just, it wasn't, being completely accurate in your storytelling wasn't a thing in the ancient world. So it wouldn't have been considered a lie or anything like that. But he says it was that many because it was during Passover. So there were not just the residents of Jerusalem, but there were people visiting from all over. But whatever it was devastating, absolutely devastating. And it was basically the end of a culture. And what came out of that city, never again was there a temple, even to this day. Never again was there a priesthood. Never again were there sacrifices. What remains of Judaism branched off into two main sects at the time. One of them was Judaism that just focused on the teachings of the rabbis and of the scripture, and books like the Talmud and different ones, which are collections of those teachings. So that became Rabbinic Judaism, which is kind of the parent of all modern Judaism. And the other kind was Messianic Judaism, which was basically people that were from that religion that received Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, and that became the early church. And that's who the book is written to. So it's written to the survivors, and it's to some extent it reflects the next generation's understanding of what the significance of that trauma was. So at the very beginning, I said, that's what an apocalypse is. It's the response to a traumatic event. And the more violent the event, the more dramatic and violent the apocalypse is, because it was devastating for those people. Yeah. So let's just continue on. He says, and the kings of the land who committed adultery and lived wantonly with her will weep and wail over her. And so there is like this, there's a weeping. In the next chapter, there's a bunch of hallelujahs. So there's, to some extent for the early church, it was bittersweet. So like John said at the beginning, he said he swallowed the scroll like the Old Testament prophet did. It was sweet in his mouth, but it was sour in his stomach. And so for the early church, they were, well, thank you, Lord, for delivering us and for protecting us and for ending, the persecution of the early church. But undoubtedly, many of them had relatives that died in it. And so it was kind of bittersweet. They were celebrating, but they were also mourning at the same time. And when they looked and they saw the smoke of her burning, standing far away, for the fear of her torment, saying, woe, woe to the great city Babylon, that strong city, for your judgment has come in 1 hour. In Jeremiah 51, it says, and Babylon was a gold cup in the Lord's hand. She made the whole earth drunk, should say land. And the nations drank her wine, therefore they have now gone mad. Babylon will suddenly fall and be broken. Wail over her. And so John's using all of these old word pictures. The merchants of the land weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. merchandise of gold and silver and precious stones, pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, scarlet, all expensive wood, every vessel of ivory, every vessel made from the most precious wood and of brass and of iron and of marble. When you think of it, the things that it's mentioning are things that come from North Africa and from Egypt and from Persia and from the north. They came from all over the empires. But if you've ever looked at it on a map, Jerusalem is the crossroads of all of those empires. So the trade routes from Mesopotamia down to Egypt ran right through Jerusalem. And if you went up to north to Europe, you go right through Jerusalem. That's why Jerusalem has been conquered 37 different times in history. And why it's still a hot spot. I don't know if you've noticed. But why it's still a contested piece of land. Nothing grows there by itself. The fact that the modern Israelis have figured out a way to put plastic underneath the dirt and get things to grow in the middle of a desert is a modern miracle. But, you know, the Bible calls it the land flowing with milk and honey. But other than a few oases like up around the Galilee, it's just very deserty and nothing grows there. So why does everybody want it? It's because of its location. It's because it's right there on the trade routes. And cinnamon and incense, perfume, frankincense, wine, olive oil, fine flour, wheat, sheep, horses, chariots, and all people's bodies and souls. The only way I could translate that is slavery was going on as well, which is taking place all throughout the ancient world. The fruits which your soul lusted after have been lost to you, and all the things that were dainty and sumptuous, I love those words, have perished from you, and you will find them no more at all. The merchants of these things who were made rich by her will stand far away in the fear of her torment, weeping and mourning, saying, woe, woe to the great city. She was dressed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls. Remember, it used all of that description about the harlot last week, because they're both two different metaphors for the same thing. It says, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, for in an hour such great riches are made desolate. That is a word that comes up. It's a very prophetic word. Daniel talks about the abomination of desolation. Desolate is almost always refers to the desolation of a city, the sacking of a city, the destruction of a city. And so in Jeremiah 50, it says, because of the wrath of Yahweh, she shall not be inhabited, but she shall be wholly, what? Yes. You got it. Everyone who goes by Babylon shall be astonished and hiss at all her plagues. In verse 17, he says, every shipmaster and everyone who sails anywhere, and mariners, as many as gain their living by the sea, stood far away and cried out as they looked at the smoke of her burning, saying, what is like the great city? Or who is like the great city? You notice I have quotation marks about this? Everything that I've been reading tonight is an oracle spoken by an angel. It's a lamentation. It's kind of, it doesn't say that they're singing it, but it's almost like a song or a taunt it's a commemorative poem commemorating the fall of Jerusalem. It says, and then they shall take up a lamentation. Oh, see, here's where I get it from. In Ezekiel. So this isn't about Babylon. This one is about the city of Tyre, which is a Phoenician city up on the north coast, a coastal city. But he borrows some language from Ezekiel as well. They shall take up a lamentation over you and tell you how you are destroyed, who are inhabited by seafaring men, the renowned city who is strong in the sea, she and her inhabitants, who caused the terror to be on all who live there. So even though it's the only apocalyptic book in the New Testament, the book of Revelation is drawn from all of these word pictures. You see? So he was very familiar with all of this. And they cast dust on their heads and cried, weeping and mourning, saying, woe, woe, the great city, in which all who had their ships in the sea were made rich by reason of their great wealth. For in 1 hour she is made, what? Desolate. Rejoice over her, O heavens, you saints, apostles, and prophets, for God has judged your judgment on her. Really interesting. And so, the book of Revelation, remember once again, history is written by the winners. The book of Revelation is making the case that part of the reason that God allowed Jerusalem to be destroyed by the Romans is to avenge the saints, apostles, and prophets. And so, could that be about Rome? Well, we know that by this time, Nero was already, had a fire in Rome, and in order to keep people from blaming him, blamed it on the Christians, and so would feed them to lions. And we think somewhere around in the 60s is when the Apostle Paul and Peter were martyred under Nero. And so sure, it included the saints and the apostles, but the prophets, here's the problem. The prophets weren't killed in Rome. He's talking about the Old Testament prophets, people like Isaiah, who one history book tells us they put him inside of a log and sawed him in half. Where were the prophets killed? The prophets were killed in Jerusalem. That's where the tie-in is there. So once again, people can make the case, well, it's Rome because Rome killed a lot of Christians. They did. So there's one of the proofs that ties it into Rome. But the prophet part is too obvious to me, especially in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels. So here's Jesus. He said, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I would have gathered your children together, even as a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, and you would not. Behold, your house is left to you, what? Desolate. You know, it's amazing. Jesus actually has a lot to say about the destruction of Jerusalem that happened 40 years after he was crucified. There's a lot in the Gospels that talk about the destruction of Jerusalem because Matthew and Luke were writing after it was destroyed. But there's a lot prophetic. And, you know, if you stop reading these things and think that Jesus is talking about the end times or the future, he actually says it right there. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, your house is left to you desolate. He's predicting, in this case, he's predicting the destruction of Jerusalem. And so it ties in. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
I actually had already turned to that scripture in Matthew 23 as we were reading through this, and already had, I was actually going to make that connection as well. But another thing, another connection that I see in here is like Jesus turning the tables in the temple.
Yes.
And talking about the merchants and all of the money and everything that was flowing into the temple that that Jesus says this is, you know, this is supposed to be a house of prayer.
Absolutely. And the money changers table was prophetic. People misunderstand that. I've heard people say that Jesus just lost his temper, but that was a very intentional and prophetic act. So the turning over of the money changers table, okay, so in Mark, he tells the story as an inclusio, which Matthew misses. Matthew doesn't get the joke. It happens about 2 or 3 times between Mark and Matthew because he is quoting and restating Matthew. But you remember on the way up to the money changers table in Mark, Jesus sees a fig tree by the side of the road that's not producing fruit, so he curses it. And then he goes up and turns over the money changers' tables. And he says, it's said that my house is to be a house of prayer, but you've turned it into a den of robbers. What were the money changers? The money changers would take your money from Galilee or whatever, and they would turn it into temple money. And the temple money was a Tyrian shekel. So I just mentioned Tyre, which is a Phoenician city, and the Tyrian shekel had an image on it. So this goes back to the mark of the beast again, which tied into the whole monetary system, which for that first century of Christian was a complete sellout. And so calling Jerusalem the great harlot and that she's committed adultery with all of her merchandise and all that stuff, she's been selling out to the Romans, given into her pagan ways because they were going to make money. So there's a polemic there. And when Jesus did that, it was on purpose. He did not lose his temper. He was there making a point, and he was actually going in to prophesy that this whole temple system is going to be destroyed. And there's an Old Testament tie-in, by the way, in Isaiah. He says, I built a garden and I put a wall around it. He's talking about Jerusalem. And then I went to look for grapes and found only thistles. And so when they walk back out of the temple, they walk by that tree and it's all withered up. That tree was a prophetic statement about the destruction of Jerusalem. And he was forecasting, he was prophesying about the fact that just like that tree, that fruitless tree got withered up, so is adulterous Jerusalem going to be destroyed. So that's a great tie-in. Another little homework assignment is that I've been quoted this from Matthew 23. Matthew 23 and 24 are quite apocalyptic. They talk about the end times. So we always think, oh, this is the end, like in the future. Read back Matthew 23 and 24 again, now that you know everything you know about the destruction of Jerusalem. And you'll say, man, I never noticed it before, but he was telling us exactly. He says, if you live in Judea, get out into the mountains. And we think, oh, that must be spiritual Judea. Or he's talking about in Judea, which was only called Judea for the time of the Roman occupation. So anyway, let's go back. I did that to Molly when we were in Honduras a couple of months ago because she was reading Matthew 24 in her devotions. And I said, you know what he's talking about? She goes, well, okay. And then I showed it to her. She doesn't like me sometimes when I disturb her devotions and tell her it means something different. We're almost done. We're on chapter 18. There's 19, 20, 21, and 22. We've got 4 weeks after tonight. Then what are we going to do? Going to be all out of Revelation. A mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone. So a millstone was, Jesus said, if you ever harm one of these children, it'd be better for you to have a millstone tied around your neck. Millstones were huge. A millstone was for going around and crushing the grain. And the biggest ones were on a big long thing, and you had to have a donkey or something roll it around. So it was huge. And cast into the sea, saying, thus with violence will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down and will be found no more at all. And so here's a word picture. Jeremiah uses it about the destruction of Babylon. He said, and it shall be when you have made an end to the reading of this book that you shall bind a stone to it and cast it into the midst of the Euphrates. And you shall say, thus shall Babylon sink and shall not rise again because of the evil that I will bring on her. And so he's recycling all of these old word pictures about Babylon. The stone is just kind of a symbol of this is how she's going to be destroyed. The voice of harpists, minstrels, and flute players and trumpeters will not be heard anymore in you at all. No craftsman of whatever craft will be found anymore in you at all. And the sound of a mill will be heard no more at all in you. There's 3 word pictures he uses right here that are all from Jeremiah. The light of the lamp will shine no more in you at all. The voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride will be heard no more in you at all. What he's saying is that just all of the good old times of the merriment, there's going to be no more joy, there's going to be no more merriment. All of those things are coming to an end. And so Jeremiah says, moreover, I will take from them the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the sound of the millstones and the light of the lamp. Almost an exact quote from him, don't you think? And then it ends by saying, for your merchants were the princes of the land, and with your sorcery all the nations were deceived. In her was found the blood of the prophets and the saints, and all who have been slain in the land. So he's talking about those that are slain in the land. You could say in the earth, but it makes a huge difference when you say land, because now you're talking about the Holy Land, talking about the Promised Land. All those that were slain in the Promised Land. Where did that happen? It's in Jerusalem. And so this is a lament about, and whether or not you think Jerusalem deserved it or not, that's kind of the point of this lament, is that that they were that it was, in part, it was God's punishment because of how they persecuted the early Christians. Revelation chapter 11. You remember this? He's talking about the 2 witnesses, and he says, and their dead bodies will be in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. So back in 11, he told us, But we'll go right by this. If you can't get it out of your head that Revelation is about the future, you miss this phrase. And it said it to us right there, where also their Lord was crucified. Where was the Lord crucified? All right, right in Jerusalem. So it makes sense. And then he says too, and it's called spiritually. I think NIV says figuratively. More literal would be spiritually called. And so how is the great city where Jesus was crucified? How is it Sodom? How is Jerusalem when it got destroyed? How is it like Sodom and Gomorrah? Because it was destroyed. Remember Lot and his family were told to get out and don't look back, and she looked back and turned into a pillar of salt. So it was the city that was getting destroyed by the Lord, and they were told to get out. Right? How is Jerusalem like Egypt? Plagues came down. All the plagues, and it mentioned those a couple chapters ago, the frogs, the lightning, all of the plagues. He said, come out so you won't share in her plagues. But it was those plagues that came down that set the children of Israel free up out of that place. So now the early church is Lot and his family. Now the early church is the children of Israel having fled Egypt. And now the early church is the survivors that came back out of Babylon. And Jerusalem is all three of those things. It's Sodom, it's Egypt, and it's Babylon. Yeah? What is our Babylon? That's the question for tonight. Are we living in Babylon, and how do we stay out of Babylon? How do we get out of Babylon? It's a big word picture for the church, but it's just talking about living a life that's different, that's been set free. Don't go back and live like you're in slavery anymore. Any questions? Yeah, Michael.
Comment. That could be your next series. How do we live and not be part
Getting
of
out of Babylon. I'm pretty sure I have messages called Leaving Babylon and Get Out of Babylon. And I think I had a series called Living in Babylon. I don't know. I've talked about it a lot because it's not something I made up. It's a very well-used motif in the Old and New Testament. But yeah, it's great.
Mike,
Yes, ma'am.
the pastor that you followed, Wayne Mail, when
Yeah.
we were living in a house that had there was just a lot of maintenance to it. And so we wanted something that was simpler. So we called Wayne, and we owned a lot next to where we was living, and talked to him about building a house there. And I said, we just want something that's low maintenance, so that we can maybe put more into the ministry. And Wayne said to me, I'll never forget this, he said to me, where your treasure is, there is your heart.
Yeah.
And he says, if that home becomes a treasure like this home is to you,
Yeah.
it's going to be your slave.
Yeah.
And so where our treasure is, there's where our heart is and what's going to keep us in this world.
That's right. Yeah. Jesus said this world is not our home. This is not our eternal resting place. So the book of Revelation, I really think it's supposed to be a very practical book. It's supposed to be a discipleship book, a devotional book. It was written to the early church as an encouragement. The trauma that they had been through was the destruction of Jerusalem. The book of Revelation was to encourage them about who they were now. Don't forget who you are. Here's the spiritual meaning of that trauma. So Dr. Huberman, broadcast, if you ever listen to him on YouTube, he's a neuropsychologist. And he says, never forget the importance of words and story to reshape and add spiritual meaning to your trauma. And so that's, in a big picture, I think, man, I almost fell off my chair when I heard him say that. Because I said, that's what the Bible was written to. It was written to a traumatized generation. That's why I always, when I'm reading the book, I'm always asking the question, who was this written to? What was their generation going through? And once you understand, or read Josephus and understand the trauma of the destruction of Jerusalem, you say, okay, now I can apply it to my life. Because they were starting over. Their old life was over, and they were starting anew. And Babylon was their old comfortable life. And he says, Babylon is fallen. Babylon is done. Babylon is over. Babylon is my past life. Yeah. Yes, sir. These are great questions. By the way, you guys always come up to me afterwards and ask me great question after everybody's gone. So we have just a minute. It'd be great if you have it, somebody else might have it.
Like I remember when Saddam Hussein was at the top of his game, and his goal was to rebuild Babylon.
Oh, yeah.
And it was well published. He had plans, and it was actually rebuilding part of it. He built a palace,
Yep.
a very lavish palace, overlooking the former city. He had started rebuilding the little parts of the city. He had bricks made, and he fancied himself as a Nebuchadnezzar, or a modern Nebuchadnezzar.
He did. He called himself the second coming of Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah.
Right, which Nebuchadnezzar was the second.
Yep.
He said he had bricks made with a phrase on them. It says, "Built by Saddam Hussein,
Yeah.
son of Nebuchadnezzar."
Exactly,
To
yeah.
glorify Iraq.
Yeah.
And I mean, we all know now still Babylon is in ruins, and his palace was sacked and just partly destroyed and partly vandalized, and then we all know what happened to Saddam himself.
Yep.
So I think it's interesting that it's still in ruins.
Well, and it makes sense. If I was Saddam Hussein and had all of that money and stuff like that, he's rebuilding one of the most glorious iterations of Iraq, right? He's going back to ancient Babylon when it was the world empire and when Babylon was the biggest city in the world, population-wise. And he did rebuild a lot of it. It's basically just a modern recreation, kind of like Fort Vancouver. It's kind of a modern recreation of the walls of Babylon and stuff like that. But you can go visit it. It's a museum now. And come to find out too, later on when the Parthians took it over, and they were one of the great competitors to the Roman Empire on the other side of the Euphrates, and then the Sassanids, and then eventually the Muslims took it over. All of them, it was a very popular tourist site. So yeah, it never completely was done for. Did you have something else, brother? Sound like you had. Who had a microphone, please?
Scaled down version.
His version was a scaled down version of Babylon?
Only because of money.
Sure. Probably. Yeah, the pictures I've seen, it doesn't look very big.
Right.
Yeah. So Babylon was a very big deal. Yeah. Go ahead.
How did Jerusalem come back after 70 AD?
How did Jerusalem come back after 70 AD? They rebuilt it. They garrisoned one of the legions there. So they rebuilt it. It became a Roman city. A few years later, Hadrian tried to. Anyway, several of the different emperors built onto it, and then of course, after Constantine Christianized the Roman Empire in 324, he sent his mother, Helena, to go and to research out, and she built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and they started building holy sites. By the way, did you see in Jerusalem that place that said that Herod's palace on the north side? That's actually on the west side. The map is turned for that video. But that's right inside the Jaffa Gate. That's one of the best preserves. That still exists. It's been rebuilt several times, but it's not usually one of the places that's on the tours of Israel. But when you come with me, it will be. Because I was sitting there, we were having lunch, and it just dawned on us, this is the palace where the wise men came. This is Herod's palace. And there's some of the old stones down on the bottom were there when the Romans took it over. And they've rebuilt those 3 towers. So that's a very famous place. The Crusaders fought over it, all sorts of. But they rebuilt it. The Romans rebuilt it as one of their cities. It was still, even though they burned all the houses, a lot of that could be rebuilt. They never rebuilt the Temple Mount. But then sometime after the Muslim conquest, sometime in the 800s, The Umayyads built the Dome of the Rock over the old Temple Mount site. Have you seen it? It's golden domed, and it was to commemorate the place of Abraham sacrificing or taking Isaac up to being sacrificed. So it wasn't to desecrate it. It was Islam considers itself the third, I guess the third stage of the Abrahamic religions. And so just like we've built on to Judaism, Islam sees themselves as being the third stage of it. So it honors much of the Old and the New Testament, but and the dome that they built was to exactly replicate the size of the dome over the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the place that Constantine's mom identified as the place where Jesus was crucified, which consequently, because of her, there is a church in England that's named St. Helen's Church, and the official from St. Helen's is after whom our town is named after. So there's that tie-in there. But Jerusalem got rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed 37 different times. 37 different times. And every one of them wanted to destroy the previous ones. The Mamluks destroyed it. The Crusaders took it over and then lost it again. It's a very famous city. And then most famously, most recently, the nation of Israel was reformed after World War II. And then they lived happily ever after. Never had any problems after that. I've done series. If you look hard enough back in my the archives on the website, you'll find series on the book on the history of Jerusalem and the history of Islam and the Crusades. If you're interested in that, it's called The Crescent and the Cross. The history of the ancient church. So there's I have several stories about all that. Anybody else? I sure love you guys and appreciate you guys. I don't know if you can tell, but this, I wasn't born knowing all of this, so it takes a little bit of research, but it's my passion. It's why I do this. I don't get paid extra to do this, but I just want to appreciate you because, if you put that much work into something, it's kind of nice if people come and listen to it. It's what I do it for, and even if you're listening online, thanks for coming online, but I just appreciate you guys. Well, would you pray with me tonight? Father God, Lord, I just pray, teach us every day, Lord, how to leave Babylon, whatever that means in our life, Lord, to realize that we are children of God and that this world is our home, but it's not our eternal home. And so, Lord, we just give you all the praise today. In Jesus' name, amen, amen. Lord bless you. Have a wonderful night. Thanks for coming.